Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first and last word poetry series. We have a wonderful program tonight, and I'm very excited to have the readers here. I would like to introduce you to Danielle Legros Georges, and she'll talk about the anthology. So, she is a poet, translator, and editor who works in the areas of contemporary U.S. poetry, Black and African diasporic poetry and literature, and Caribbean, Latin American, and Haitian studies. Her work has been supported by fellowships and grants from the institutions, including the American Antiquarian Society, the Boston Foundation, the Mass Cultural Council, PEN Translation Fund, and the Black Metropolis Research Consortium. In 2014, she was named Poet Laureate of Boston. Her four-year term included collaborations with area artists, literary organizations, museums, libraries, and schools, and representation of Boston at international events. She is Professor Emeritus of Creative Writing at Lesley University. And if you would like to know more information about her, check out her website. It's Danielle Legros Georges.com. And I give you Danielle.
Thank you, Gloria. And hello, everyone. I'm very, very happy to be here this evening with you to talk about the Wheatley at 250 project, and really thrilled to have contributor Pamela Mordecai with us and my co-editor Artress Bethany White here this evening. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the origin story of the anthology, and then share some information about Phillis Wheatley, which you may or may not know. And then if I have time, I'll share my contribution before we hear from Artress and then Pamela. So back in 2022, I was asked by the Colonial Society of Massachusetts to design a public-facing program to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the publication of Phillis Wheatley Peters's book, then Phillis Wheatley, in London in 1773. And I thought, okay, I can do this. A panel is typically what is expected. And I thought I could wrestle up some of my colleagues, especially folks who work on Wheatley, to talk to the public about Wheatley. Then I thought, often we enter into discussions about Wheatley through her biography, which is extraordinary, right? But ask someone to quote a Wheatley poem beyond on being brought from Africa to America, right? And hardly any of us, myself included, then could do it. And I thought, here's a really wonderful opportunity to think about her poetry, think about ways to enter into conversation with her as a poet. And I thought it would be really great to gather poets to think about Phillis Wheatley's poetry, to reinscribe or to translate, if you will, or to make covers of the original text, the source text, right? Written in this very fine, high 18th century English that was Phillis Wheatley Peters's. And so I thought, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to get poets together to reinscribe Wheatley. I'm going to invite some friends. And since we're doing this, we may as well make a chapbook, right? To commemorate the occasion. And as I called people and talked to folks were excited, and the chapbook became, more than a chapbook. And I pitched the idea of an anthology to a couple of publishers, including Pangyris, where my colleague and friend, Artress Bethany White, was. And so Pangyris agreed to publish the book, and I invited Artress to join me as an editor on the book, and off we went. And calling people, imploring, asking, and so on. And we were just really thrilled to get the kind of feedback that we got. And then, of course, the incredible poems that we got for the anthology. So essentially the format was we asked people to take an original Wheatley poem to respond, remake, translate it, and then to write about their process of this transformation. And so this is what appears in the anthology: the Wheatley original, not in this order, the Wheatley original, the new poem, and then the essay, the brief essay. So that's how this project got started. And so I'll speak a little bit about Phillis Wheatley Peters, and then we'll move forward. So as you know, Wheatley Peters is the author of the 1773 book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, published in London. And she's been called and is many things, including the West African girl kidnapped from her home, and the enslaved girl in Boston's Wheatley family in 1761, as well as the acclaimed 18th century transcontinental poet. June Jordan, the poet, in a magnificent 2006 essay entitled "The Difficult Miracle of Black Poetry in America," names Wheatley the first decidedly American poet on this continent, end quote. By virtue of the keen attention Wheatley paid to the turbulent events of her time and the revolutionaries who would forge America. So in 1776, as you know, the United States was yet to be the United States, and Wheatley was witnessing and documenting the events of her time and the emergence of this country as we know it. The historian Henry Louis Gates Jr. situates Wheatley squarely in the colonial and post-colonial debates that sought to confirm or dismiss Black intelligence. And as a consequence of her distinction as a poet, she was thrust into a cosmopolitan space and where she found herself in conversation with such figures as George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. So here she was, this young woman, a Black teenager, talking to these dudes, right? writing Washington as he was attempting to make this country. And she was also in correspondence posthumously with Thomas Jefferson, whose 1785 notes on the state of Virginia prefers scathing and undeserved criticism. For Jefferson to have recognized her talent and her intelligence would have been, of course, to recognize the talent and intelligence of all of those he had enslaved and from whose labor he had greatly benefited. So endorsers of Wheatley's 1773 book identified themselves, or endorsers, or what we would call blurbers today, identified themselves as the most respectable characters in Boston, and included the governor and lieutenant governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Of her poems, they remarked, "She has been examined by some of the best judges and thought qualified to write them." Less restrained, a biographer, a Wheatley biographer today, David Wallstreicher, notes, "She became fluent and culturally literate and able to write poems in English so quickly that we shouldn't hesitate to call her a genius." There's been some really wonderful recent scholarship on Wheatley, including Honoré Fanon-Jeffers's very well-researched 2020 collection of poems, The Age of Phillis, which is a fantastic book. I encourage everybody to get a hold of it and read it. And in it, she advances the argument for referring to Wheatley by her married name, Wheatley Peters. At the time of her death, she was still married to John Peters. And this is important historical detail liberates Wheatley Peters from perpetual historical adolescence. So we can separate the celebrated but enslaved teenage poet from the free and married lady and author. Tara Bynum, a scholar of literary histories, in another great book, Reading Pleasures, Everyday Black Living in Early America, deepens our understanding of Wheatley's inner life by identifying Wheatley's letters, or Wheatley Peters's letters, as a means by which she quote, delights in the pleasures of her living in spite of and because of the world at large. We know that she was in correspondence with another enslaved African woman by the name of Obor Tanner in Newport, Rhode Island. And there's a recent theory that suggests that Obor Tanner may have even been Wheatley's shipmate, right? And that they recognized each other, which I find just really, really interesting, and look forward to what comes out of that theory. So Phillis Wheatley Peters called herself an Ethiop, an African, and a poet. She named herself a friend to, among others, Tanner, with whom she had a long epistolary friendship, Scipio Moorhead, a young African painter, Samson Okum, a Mohegan Presbyterian evangelist, and Selina Hastings, the English Countess of Huntingdon, who was instrumental in funding the publication of poems on various subjects, religious and moral. She saw her verse published on both sides of the Atlantic, in London and Boston. And in addition to naming herself Ethiopian African, she named herself wife to John Peters, whom she married in 1778, and the mother of their children. The historian Cornelia Dayton, in an article entitled Lost Years Recovered, John Peters and Phillis Wheatley Peters in Middleton, Massachusetts, offers a narrative that runs counter to the popular unfavorable ones regarding what transpired between the Peterses. John Peters has, until very recently, been drawn as just an irresponsible husband and a bad dude, right? But I think we know why. He was a Black man with agency in the moment in which he was living, which could have engendered some animus. All right, so she writes, among John Peters's chief efforts was to insulate his wife from physically taxing housewifery and to create space and time for her to inhabit a writer's life and to be a mother. So she was an acclaimed writer and political actor in her lifetime, but she wouldn't live to see herself as an inspiration for an immense number of scholarly, literary, and creative texts like our text. She wouldn't see the Boston plaque commemorating the site where she was purchased. That's a hard word, purchased, nor the likeness of her likeness in the form of a bronze statue on the city's Commonwealth Avenue Mall. And some of you have seen that very beautiful statue made by Meredith Bergman. She wouldn't see the buildings and lecture halls named after her, named for her after her death, unexpected death in 1784, while she was still a very young woman in her early 30s. And a second manuscript known to have been circulating at the time of her death has never been recovered. And I just, oh, if only it can emerge. Anyway, we won't know. We don't have that manuscript, and we don't know exactly where she's been buried. And we don't yet know, or may never know, her true name, to borrow a phrase from Pamela Mordecai, the name given to her by her parents, by her family. But many of us call her sister, ancestor, and many of us name her the mother of African American literature and a luminary of United States letters. So that's just a very brief introduction to Phillis Wheatley Peters and to some of the recent scholarship that takes up her work and her life. And I have not timed myself, so I don't know if I've gone beyond 10 minutes, Gloria, if you, I don't know.
Go ahead and continue.
Okay. So I'm going to just read to you the poem that I re-inscribed. But before I do so, I'm going to read to you the Wheatley poem. No, the poem that I re-inscribed. Okay, and then my own poem. There you go. All right, there it is. There it is. Okay. I re-inscribed On Being Brought from Africa to America. And it's a poem in which she challenges Christians to consider whether their Christianity and slavery are compatible. She herself is a Christian at this point. On being brought from Africa to America. 'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain may be refined and join the angelic train. On being brought from Africa to America, a re-inscription. It was mercy indeed who carried me from what was deemed my pagan land. Mercy, you showed my soul to me, taught me to understand that God exists, that something greater exists too. Now, mercy, who knew what you and I knew? Some say and see the dark as dead, as colored by a knot and dread. I say, I name us fully, Cain, daughters exiled, sons of rain. In us the flood, the moon and tide, horizons, uncut shores and lines, and more, the raised and versed libations to the waiting sun. Thanks. And now I want to introduce Artress Bethany White, my co-editor, and I'll read from her biography. Artress Bethany White is Associate Professor of English at East Stroudsburg University, and she's a poet, essayist, and literary critic. She's the recipient of the Trio Award for her poetry collection, My America Poems, published by Trio House Press in 2019. Her prose, Survivor's Guilt, Essays on Race and American Identity, received a 2022 Next Generation Finalist Indie Book Award. Recent work of hers appears in the anthology Why I Wrote This Poem, 62 Poets on Creativity and Craft. And she has received scholarships and residencies from the Sewanee Writers Conference and Breadloaf. You can find more information about her on her website, artressbethanywhite.com. Artress Bethany White.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for that introduction and for the introduction of the program, right? It's so wonderful to see everyone here tonight. So one of the things that I do when I'm introducing students who are not familiar with poetry to poetry is I tell them not to try to understand everything that they're reading right away, but as they're reading through the poem, to look for a point of entree. When does the poem begin to have meaning or connection? for them. And one of the things that I noticed when we began to get submissions back from those invited to be contributors to this collection was people focusing on a point of entree in Phillis Wheatley's work. And this was really important because in putting this together, one of the thoughts that we had was introducing Wheatley's work to a newer generation who may feel very alienated from her language, which was, the 18th century diction of her day. And so this point of entree on behalf of contributors would inevitably become this introduction that we were looking for to those who are new to her work, as readers, as students, even as scholars, right? Because, you don't often know about someone until their work crosses your plate. So I really was excited about that, right? And in the prose statements that people have appendaged to their reinscriptions, that point of entree really resonates very strongly, and why I'm so excited to hear Pamela Mordecai share her work. Right. So what I want to do is read from my prose statement first, and then read a section of Phillis Wheatley's poem. And the poem that I am reinscribed was her to the Right Honorable William Earl of Dartmouth, His Majesty's Principal Secretary of State for North America, etc. The title of my statement is Afrique's Irony, a word on resistance. To the Right Honorable William Earl of Dartmouth, His Majesty's Principal Secretary of State for North America, etc., has always been one of my favorite poems to introduce to students when teaching Phillis Wheatley Peters, because it displays a skillful discursive pivot away from Revolutionary era desire to Black liberation politics. Imagine the challenge of curbing a natural boldness, which Wheatley definitely embodied, in order to be seen as an appropriately civil Black girl, while enmeshed in 18th century Euro-American and European society. Wheatley was an adroit thinker, intellectual, and cosmopolitan of her day. Taking all aspects of her unique subject position into account, in my poem, I capitalize on that essential pivot in Wheatley's original work in order to enhance the metonymic significance of the term Afrique. The diminutive of Africa was clearly an easier fit for the poet's use of iambic pentameter, but it also served to center the continent of Africa as a legitimate place where families, love, and culture abound. Wheatley fretted over her destiny and what her life might have been if she had remained among her African countrymen. For Wheatley, the page became a safe space to articulate, uncontested, the words of her heart. This form of Black resistance during enslavement often goes unremarked in American educational pedagogies, daring to include the study of early African American literature. The page unequivocally provided a means for Wheatley to resist the racial status quo. The term African American is a nomenclature of descent, and it's meant to recall the rich history of the African continent and its global presence throughout the African diaspora. Today, so few in America are educated about the continent that the reference has become localized and deferential. Yet in Wheatley's era, the international slave trade was still in full operation, and Africa meant fresh human cargo, easily translatable to saleable goods and wealth. Imagine a colonial era Phillis caught up in the conundrum of why the masterminds behind the American Revolution could not make the leap from their fear of colonial white slavery to the need to simultaneously dismantle African enslavement with a single revolutionary act. Tellingly, a mere 2 years after the publication of poems on various subjects, religious and moral, Phillis Wheatley's collection, Virginia Governor Lord Dunmore would extend freedom to all indentured servants and Negroes who would cast off their rebel masters to fight for the British. And to the Right Honorable William Earl of Dartmouth, His Majesty's Principal Secretary of State for North America, etc., Wheatley is aware of how the status of Blacks in the colonies is ripe for change, and that change is in the hands of the British American peerage reigning over them. In using the term Afrique in her poem, the African American poet is demanding to be seen by recalling the continent that produced her and her fellow Africans still being wrongfully monetized for global greed. So my entree into Phillis Wheatley's work was in her resistance to that status quo. Some might see it as subtle, some might see it as obvious, but I always saw her as a poet writing resistance. She was living out her resistance from surviving a system that was meant to do everything but see her survival. And she clearly was an advocate for emancipation for her fellow enslaved. So the resistance section of the poem that I reinscribed comes in the third stanza. She is addressing the Right Honorable William Earl of Dartmouth and letting him know why she understands what the revolutionary desire for freedom from Britain is really about. She understands it because of her own enslavement. Should you, my lord, while you peruse my song, wonder from whence my love of freedom sprung, whence flow these wishes for the common good, by feeling hearts alone best understood. I, young in life, by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afrique's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breasts. Steeled was that soul, and by no misery moved, that from a father seized his babe beloved. Such my case. And can I then but pray others may never feel tyrannic sway? And that was Phillis Wheatley. Thank you.
So Pamela Mordecai was born in Jamaica, a former language arts teacher with a PhD in English. She was for 14 years author, editor of the Caribbean Journal of Education. She is the author of more than 30 books, including textbooks, children's books, anthologies, 9 collections of poetry, a reference work on Jamaica, a collection of short fiction, and a novel. She has edited groundbreaking anthologies of Caribbean women's writing. In 2010, her play El Numero Uno premiered at the Lorraine Kimsa Theater for Young People, and in March 2016 had its Caribbean premiere at the Edna Manley School for the Performing and Visual Arts. Her debut novel, Red Jacket, was one of 5 books shortlisted for the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Award in 2015. For more information, visit her website at PamelaMordecai.com. Please welcome Pamela Mordecai.
Thank you very much, Harris. Sorry, I just saw my son, David. That's why his name is in my mouth. I'm very glad to be here. I think I'm in awe of the project that Danielle and Artress hatched, shall I say hatched? And I'm very privileged to have been asked. I am going to claim a further privilege as being closest in time to Phillis Wheatley Peters. Anyway, I'm going to read this many times because the company I'm keeping is extraordinary. and I'm gonna hurry because I don't want to go over time. Old teacher, like to stay within the time given to me. So I am going to take Artress's idea of the point of entry. I suppose my point of entry for Phillis's poem is that both of us meet. I write poetry for children in which rhyme and rhythm are strong. So the whole idea of how Phillis was working was very familiar to me, very comfortable. Also, like my forebear, Louise Bennett Coverley, and I guess I go from Phillis to Louise to what I did. Louise worked in traditional forms, but she worked in Jamaican Creole. So I wanted to say a couple of things, or maybe three, that just reading through this collection, because I'm not going to claim to be familiar with Wheatley Peters's poetry, but it strikes me that she is doing what Jamaican people call playing fool to catch wise often. And she's dismissed because people read her straight. She needs to be read slant. I am going to use a quote from Rosamond King, her reinscription of the poem of Phillis's reply to the answer. She says, this is Rosamond, Phillis, in line after line, played supplicant to Grecian muses, but you were always your own. You were always our own. Best thing, winking away, too few can hear, even centuries after. The winking, I think, is what is crucial. I think Wheatley Peters, Phillis was herself when she celebrated goodness, virtue. She was herself wonderfully empathetic to all kinds of people, many of whom she would not have known. But I am convinced that when she cares absolutely and utterly. It must have exhausted her, would have exhausted me. She enjoys nature, but when she's ready, she talks slant. And if you dismiss her, then obviously you're not reading with care. You're not reading slant. You're not seeing where she is. And she, in this poem, she begins by, saluting the muse and attend my lays, ye ever honored nine, the muses, and so on. But at the end of her first verse, she says, for bright aurora now demands my song. Demands, I find an interesting word. And she goes on celebrating nature in her second verse. In her third verse, though, she gets down to business. She says, ye shady groves, your verdant gloom display to shield your poet from the burning day. So the shady groves, dark, are verdant, gloomy, verdant, and she sees them as shielding your poet. She belongs to them, to this darkness, to this comfortable shading, giving, I guess, care, succor, protecting her from the bright rays. Coming up in the last verse. See, in the east, the illustrious king of day, I could read this with great sarcasm. I think she probably meant it that way. His rising radiance drives who away? Drives the shades away. But oh, I feel his fervid beams too strong and scarce begun, concludes the abortive song. The brightness is a killing brightness. It is something that wrings her song from her throat. It chokes her. She cannot sing. In my translation, I heard or read somewhere, and it's maybe I just read it wrong. Maybe it's total craziness. But somebody saying that real American literature is inaugurated by Phillis Wheatley Peters and Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. 100 years difference, but I'm prepared to entertain it. What I find interesting is that here is a Black woman, and she is writing in white people's language and white people's style. And the other guy is a white guy. And what does he do but appropriate Black people's language for Huck Finn? It's interesting. I like the idea. Anyway, I was very challenged by the I don't know, I didn't know, I knew very clearly that I wanted to write Jamaican Creole. But I won't read the description of my process because I think it would take too much time. I've claimed to be old. I am 81 years old, so I am old. And what I do is in the poem, give myself the privilege of not only ranging across the Jamaican Creole continuum, which you can play like a piano. One end is near to English, the other end is near to very deep Jamaican patois. So I range along it. Sometimes I is I, and sometimes I is me. Sometimes she is she, but sometimes she is him. Him being a very old form. Him can pregnant. In Jamaican language, impregnant. Impregnant, right? But I also use old terms as well as new ones. Day clean is a very old, no longer used Jamaican term for morning. But in here also is big up and Don Dada. Don Dada being out of drug culture, the Don Dada of Dons, the Don Gorgon, the highest Don is your Don Dada. And this is how I describe the illustrious King of Day. True Don Dada, yes. So I will just read my reinscription. There are other things that were difficult to move from Phillis's poem into Jamaican language, like and also my poem sort of took off when it was ready. Things like lays and the gentle zephyr and bowers and so on were hard to find equivalents for in Jamaican, but I did my best. So here is chorus for day clean, and chorus itself being a word that is resonant, I think, for Black people coming forward in time. Chorus for day clean. Oh, nine high sistren, listen to me crooning, help bear me burden and fine tune me tuning. Roll out the notes, cool, melismatic, scatty, like how bright day clean need a song from me. Big up poor morning. Praise the thousand tint that pretty up high heaven as you sprint across. Day wake and spreading beam them wide. Soft breeze take every leaf and a joy ride. Sweet song the bird them start make one more time. Shine eye look all bout, dyed feathers shake fine. Dark wood, beg you show me a shady spot to hide your poet from the day sun hot. Calliope, gal, you don't hear your name. Fingle the holy harp while your Chris sistren fan the sweet, sweet flame. Flowers, garden, breeze, sky with all kind of shade. Me breast them rising with the grand parade. Queer sunrise, Don Dada of the day, busting out brightness should the dark away. But why him beam so strong, them burn me skin? Song done same time, and me just start to sing. Thanks for listening.
I love that reinscription. It's just so it's so sonic in the way that Wheatley is sonic. It's plays such great attention to sound and pays such great attention to sound, and it's so imaginative. It's such a wonderful text. Thank you. Thank you. And Artress, I so appreciated your essay. Just really thinking about Wheatley's subjectivity and her agency as well. And Gloria, I don't know what happens next. Is there a Q&A or is there an open mic?
We will have a short Q&A if anyone would like to ask any questions. I'm going to put everyone on gallery view so we could see if anyone raises their hand. So let me do that now. There we go. If anyone has any questions, please ask.
And while the questions are emerging, I want to encourage you to consider getting a hold of this magnificent anthology. It's published by Pangyris. And you can just, oh, here it is, Artress. Thank you. Just put the link to the to the book page in the chat. So you can avail yourself of this wonderful text. We have 20 contributors, including Tracy K. Smith. Artress, do you want to help me out here?
Gabrielle Seville, Evie Shockley, author of Semi-Automatic and Suddenly We, Rosamund King.
Yeah, the wonderful. And many, many others.
So any questions? Anyone?
David has a question.
Okay, David, go ahead. Thank you.
It's not so much a question, it's a testimonial. So I'll just speak up for the volume myself. I've read it, I have it, and I think that besides the importance of the core concept, the way that the whole reinscription project plays out among 20 poets is just fascinating. It goes in all kinds of directions, and so I'm just speaking up for the book. That's it.
Thanks. Lee Varon?
Yeah,
Lee?
I love that idea of reading slant, because I remember when I was, I guess, very young, reading her and just kind of being put off. But then as I got older, I started to read in a different way. And then I saw a whole other level of things that were being said, you know. So I appreciate your talking about that, reading her slant. It was helpful. Thank you.
Lee, thank you so much for that comment. And I'm going to say this, that if you know an educator who would benefit from the book, who might consider teaching Wheatley's work, please consider either gifting it or leading them to the site where they can get a copy, because it's terrible to think about younger generations not being introduced to this iconic literary ancestor. And this book is meant to open the way for people to feel more comfortable in sharing her work. It's a contemporary entree into her work. So thank you, Lee.
Yes, yes, I loved it when somebody talked, I forgot who said about the entree into a poem.
Artress.
That's what this volume obviously does. It's an entree into her work.
One of the concepts we considered was the concept of the cover in sort of the musical realm, how an artist can write a song, but another artist can interpret it in such a way that makes it, that amplifies it, that makes it especially special. Nina Simone, for example, covering Feeling Good, right, really made that song, really pushed that song into the public. And Sinead O'Connor's Nothing Compares to You, written by whom? I always ask folks, anybody know? But there's Rachel Prince, yes, written by Prince. But she took that poem and just magnified it and blew it up so beautifully. So I think these poems in some ways operate in a similar way, the new poems.
Anyone else? Yes, go ahead, Rachel.
I'll just say really quickly, it's more of a comment than a question, as one says. But I have not typically taught Wheatley. I do teach an introduction to the English major for our incoming students. And I can really see using, some of the poems, the original poems and the reinscriptions from this text for my students, because I think that students are always, it's hard sometimes to get students into poems, into poetry, especially as they enter the major. It feels very intimidating to them, but they're very familiar with the idea of covers, and they're very interested in the idea of translation. And if you say to them, like, look at what these poets have done with this Phillis Wheatley poem, and then maybe even offer them an opportunity, right? Like, pick one of the poems out of the collection, and why don't you do a reinscription or a translation or a cover of this? So I'm excited about the possibilities for this text in my own classroom and those of my colleagues. So thank you, all of you, very much.
I want to say one thing. The reading tonight was informative, erudite, and also the highest quality, partly because of the readers themselves, but also they were very complimentary to the poetry that they were representing. And so I thank you. You made it very special.